The wind screamed across the open prairie, throwing dust like daggers against the windows of the lonesome house that stood crookedly on the last road before the hills swallowed everything. It had been years since Ellen heard laughter inside these walls. The only voice now was the groaning of timber and the echo of her own footsteps. Each board beneath her creaked as if to remind her of every moment that had passed since silence became her only companion. She rose early that morning as she did every morning. Not from obligation nor hope, those had long since died, but from habit. Grief had no alarm, and yet it woke her faithfully before dawn. She wrapped herself in the same worn flannel, stepped barefoot onto the icy wood floor, and filled the kettle with water she had fetched from the well the day before. There was no plumbing, no internet, no signal. That's how she had wanted it when she moved here, alone, far from the reach of the world and further from the weight of its memories. The photograph on the mantel had curled at the corners. In it, her husband grinned wide, arm wrapped around their daughter, both beaming with the kind of unfiltered joy that only comes when time feels infinite. Ellen rarely looked at it now, not because she had forgotten them but because she hadn't. The ache was sharper on the days she allowed herself to remember too clearly. Their deaths had come a year apart. First her daughter, taken by a cruel, swift cancer that left no room for bargaining, then her husband, who simply never came home from a walk, the note folded in his coat pocket as final as a slammed door. She lived now in that absence, in the vacuum left behind by love. The fields around her lay dead, the barn leaning toward collapse, the fence posts split and warped from years of neglect. A grocery run was a once-a-month ordeal, and even then she'd ration the dry goods carefully, not from poverty but because she didn't care enough to waste. The world could have ended, and Ellen wouldn't have known until the sky turned black and the stars fell down. That morning, though, something shifted. She stepped outside, mug in hand, and saw them, hoof prints. Faint but unmistakable. Pressed into the damp earth just beyond the porch, they led from the northern hills to her broken fence, then back again. Her breath caught shallow. She hadn't seen a horse out here in years. Not since the wild herds were driven deeper into the hills by drought and men with pens and trailers. The prints were large, sharp-edged. A Mustang perhaps. Maybe two. She stood perfectly still, listening. Only wind. But something, some impulse, made her set down the mug and walk toward the edge of the yard. The hoof prints curved into a narrow gap in the fence, one she'd never bothered to mend. The earth was soft from the recent rains. Ellen followed the prints, slowly, until the land dipped into a low, grassy hollow. He was there. The stallion. His coat was the color of wet ash, dapples melting into darkness along his flanks. Mud clung to his legs. He stood motionless in the field, head turned slightly, ears forward, not startled, not panicked. Just watching. Ellen froze. For a long time they stared at one another. The stallion blinked once, then twice. His tail flicked and he took one step forward. The earth held its breath. Her hand trembled, suspended halfway to her chest, unsure if she was about to wave or protect herself. But the stallion didn't approach. Nor did he retreat. He seemed instead to wait. She didn't know how long they stood there, two broken things connected by a silence more powerful than speech. Eventually the wind shifted, and the horse turned, muscles rolling beneath his skin, and loped away toward the ridge. Ellen followed the sound of his hooves until it faded, until there was nothing but grass swaying beneath the first light of morning. Back at the house, she rummaged through the cabinet, searching for something. At last she found the last apple, soft but still whole. She cut it into quarters and carried the pieces out to the fence post. She placed them there gently and walked away. That night, she dreamed of her daughter for the first time in months. Not the frail, pale child with hollow eyes that haunted her waking hours, but the laughing, wild-spirited girl who used to run barefoot through the woods, her braids bouncing behind her. She awoke with tears crusted on her face, her hands curled as though she tried to hold something in her sleep. When she stepped outside, the apple slices were gone. The hoof prints were back. He returned again the next day, and the day after that. Always at a distance, never close enough to touch. Ellen began to expect him. She left carrots, oats, and the occasional piece of stale bread on the fence. He never came when she stood outside, but the food always disappeared. Sometimes she caught sight of him on the horizon, his silhouette striking against the sky's purple bruises at dusk. She started talking to him, quietly at first. Just whispers as she placed the food down. "I don't even know your name," she'd say. "You probably have one already. Something wild. Something real." But when she finally decided to name him, she chose Ghost. Because that's what he was. Something that shouldn't have been there, something that carried the shape of salvation but stayed just out of reach. He was the echo of all she'd lost and the only thing that reminded her the world still moved beyond her grief. One evening, she stood beside the fence longer than usual. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, a streak of fire along the hills. Ghost stood halfway up the ridge, his figure outlined like a statue carved from storm clouds. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, "but you keep coming back." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ghost didn't move. "I used to help people, you know. I was a nurse. I used to fix things. Now I can't even fix this place, this life." Still, the stallion watched her. She stepped closer to the fence. "But I want to. I just don't know how anymore." The wind blew through the grass like a whisper. Ghost turned then, slowly, and walked down the hill, stopping just short of the fence. He lowered his head. His breath steamed in the cooling air. For a heartbeat, Alan thought he might step over the boundary, close the final distance. But he didn't. He raised his head again, stared into her eyes, and then turned and galloped away, hooves pounding a rhythm that echoed long after he vanished into the dusk. Alan stood there until the stars came out. The next morning he didn't come. Nor the next. By the third day the food remained untouched, the hoof prints faded under the wind. It was the same loss all over again. Something in her chest crumbled quietly. Still, she placed the carrots on the fence each morning, though she no longer expected to see him. The silence was heavier now, not just grief, but the loss of a presence she hadn't realized she needed. She moved through her routines with a quiet ache, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted and was not coming back. Then, just before dawn on the fifth day, a sound stirred her from sleep. Not hoofbeats. Something smaller. Something limping. She wrapped herself in her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the darkness, heart pounding for reasons she could not name. She didn't know what waited in the brush. But somehow she knew it had something to do with him. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dawn mist like a sword, trembling slightly in Ellen's hand. The grass was slick with dew, the sky tinted the color of worn parchment. Every instinct told her to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the house, to let the silence reclaim what had been disturbed. But something in the cry she'd heard, thin, broken, pleading, refused to let her go. She moved slowly, her boots muffled in the wet earth, the light skimming over the fence post where the uneaten carrots still rested. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped thing. The cry came again, barely louder than a whimper, a sound so raw and small it could have been the wind, except it wasn't. She turned toward the brush along the edge of the field, sweeping the beam across the tangled undergrowth. Then she saw it. A foal. Tiny, trembling, collapsed at the base of a twisted cedar. Its legs were folded beneath it at awkward angles, ribs jutting under patchy fur, eyes wide with a fear too ancient for something so young. A fresh gash bled across its flank, glinting wet and red beneath the light. The foal didn't move, not even when Ellen stepped closer. She dropped to her knees. "Oh God," she whispered. It was alone. No sign of a mare, no sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Ghost hadn't returned for days. Had this been his? Was this why he came back to her? Why he'd watched her so carefully, why he'd stood so still, so silent? The foal flinched as she reached out. Its breath came in short, sharp gasps. One eye rolled, panicked, then stilled again. Ellen didn't touch it yet. She simply knelt there, letting it feel her presence, the warmth of her, the fact that she wasn't going to hurt it. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." But the words tasted like lies. She knew nothing was truly safe out here. Still, she took off her coat and wrapped it gently around the foal's thin body. It barely registered the warmth. She glanced back toward the house, over 100 yards away, and then down at the broken creature in her arms. She would have to carry it. It was small but even so awkward. She shifted the weight onto her shoulder, cradling the foal's long legs in her arms, and began the long walk back across the field. Her back screamed. Her lungs burned. Every step threatened to buckle beneath her. The foal made no sound. By the time she reached the porch, she was trembling. Inside, she cleared a space in the kitchen and laid it gently on a pile of old blankets. She fetched warm water, cleaned the wound with trembling hands, then wrapped it in gauze torn from the remnants of her nursing days. The supplies were expired, the linens yellowed, but she used what she had. The foal didn't resist. It simply watched her, those eyes, deep and dark and impossibly knowing, never leaving her face. She fed it a mixture of warm milk and water from a bottle meant for lambs, whispering to it all the while. She told it stories. About her daughter and her husband. About the time they'd camped by the lake and heard a cougar scream in the night, how they'd huddled together in one tent, scared and thrilled and impossibly alive. She told the foal things she hadn't said aloud in years. She didn't expect it to live, but it did. Through the night it breathed, faintly, steadily, and by morning it stirred. She called him Ash. It wasn't a name chosen for poetry, it was what he looked like, covered in soot and bone and something burnt. It suited him, and he didn't seem to mind. Ellen built a makeshift pen inside the living room, pushing aside furniture to make space. Ash stayed curled for days, rising only when she coaxed him. He nuzzled her palm when she brought him milk. He whinnied faintly when she left the room. The days passed in strange rhythm. Feeding, cleaning, watching, waiting. For the first time in years, Ellen felt needed. Not passively, truly wholly needed. Her hands had purpose again. Her days were punctuated with small victories. Ash standing on his own. Ash drinking without protest. Ash pressing his warm head against her chest and sighing as if she were his whole world. She began mending things. Not just Ash but the house, the fence, the barn. She swept out the corners that had gathered dust since the funeral. She fixed the squeaky door. She planted wildflowers along the edge of the field, unsure if they'd take, but planting them anyway. It wasn't healing, not exactly. It was something more fragile, more dangerous. Hope. At night, she would sit beside the pen and talk to Ash as he dozed. She told him everything. Her rage. Her sorrow. The way the world had gone silent when her daughter died and never truly spoke again. How she had begged for a sign, any sign, that the pain meant something, that she wasn't just a ghost in a body waiting to fail. "You're not much of a sign," she'd murmur, smiling through tears. "But you're here." Ash blinked slowly, his breath steady and warm. Still she worried. About Ghost. About why the foal had been left. About what danger might have driven the stallion away, or worse, whether he had even survived. One morning as she stood on the porch with Ash now tottering beside her, she saw it again, hoof prints in the soil. Not many. Just one set. Deep. Heavy. A sign. Her pulse quickened. Over the following days they appeared more often. Fresh tracks at the edge of the property, sometimes close to the fence where she left food, sometimes looping back toward the hills. But Ghost never showed himself. It was as if he were watching. Waiting. She started leaving notes with the food. Folded scraps of paper tucked beneath the oats. Silly things. Thank yous. Promises. Once she wrote, *, he's still here. He's safe. Come see for yourself. *. But there was no reply. Ash grew stronger. His coat lost its dullness. His legs, once thin as twigs, now held him steady when he trotted awkwardly across the yard. He never strayed far from Ellen. He was bonded now deeply, and she knew what that meant. He would never go back to the wild. And somehow neither would she. The house changed with him. The rooms filled with light again. Ellen hung wind chimes made from rusted spoons on the porch. She painted the front door, a pale, hopeful blue. She opened the windows and let the air carry laughter back inside. Still she missed Ghost. One night a storm rolled over the ridge. Thunder cracked the sky wide open. Rain came in sheets and Ash trembled beneath the table. Ellen comforted him, arms wrapped tightly, whispering soft reassurances. But a part of her was listening, for hooves. For the return of the stallion who had brought her this broken miracle and vanished before he could see what it had become. She fell asleep on the floor beside Ash, her hand buried in his mane. When she awoke, the rain had stopped. The earth steamed in the pale dawn. And outside, just beyond the fence, stood Ghost. Unmistakable. Majestic. Alive. He didn't move as she stepped barefoot into the wet grass. Ash trotted beside her, stopping at the fence, curious but calm. Ellen stood on the other side. Their eyes met once more. No words passed between them. None were needed. She stepped back, gestured gently toward Ash, who now nuzzled her side. Ghost did not approach. He gave a low whinny, deep and resonant, then turned slowly toward the ridge. And this time, Ellen didn't feel abandoned. This time she understood. He had brought her a gift. And he had stayed long enough to see what she would do with it. The wind had shifted. It rolled down from the ridge with a different cadence now, faster, sharper, as if something unseen moved with it. Ellen noticed first in the way the birds fell silent, their usual morning chatter gone. Then in Ash, who stiffened near the barn, ears pricked, his body still as glass. The air buzzed with something unspoken. Instinct, old, feral, gripped him. Ellen stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes. The sun hung low and bright behind drifting clouds, the landscape painted in silvers and golds. Ash stood in the middle of the pasture, head turned toward the forest line. Something was out there. Something watching. She felt it too. At first she thought it might be Ghost again. But this didn't feel the same. This presence had weight behind it, Urgency. She didn't move, just waited, letting the silence stretch long and taut. Then the figure stepped into the clearing. It wasn't Ghost. It was a mare. A wild one, tall and lean, her coat a dappled storm gray, her mane tangled with twigs and leaves. She was beautiful and battered, one flank streaked with dried blood. Behind her, two more horses emerged. One young, not much older than Ash, the other a limping stallion with a wound that glistened even from a distance. Ellen didn't breathe. The mare stared across the field, locking eyes with her. She didn't flinch, didn't twitch. Her nostrils flared as she studied Ellen, then flicked to Ash, who took a hesitant step forward. He gave a soft, uncertain whinny. And the mare answered. Not with sound, but with movement. A low toss of her head. A step closer. It wasn't affection, it was command. Something primal. Ellen's heart clenched. Ash looked back at her. A choice stood between them. He was bonded to her. Of that she had no doubt. But his body still carried the wild in its bones, and now the wild had come back, bruised, bleeding, but present. Ellen moved slowly, walking down into the field, her hands open and low. She didn't speak. She didn't want to scare them off. The mare watched every step, every breath. When Ellen reached Ash, she laid her hand gently on his back. He nuzzled her, then turned to the herd. He took another step toward them, then stopped. The mare called again, louder this time, her hooves stirring the grass. Ash shook his head, and stayed. The moment passed. The wild did not reclaim him. Instead it lingered. Over the next week, the mare and her two companions kept their distance but didn't leave. They made a loose camp just beyond the creek that bordered Ellen's land. She left food, oats, apples, clean water, near the edge. Not too close. Just close enough to be seen. They came at dusk. Drinking. Eating. Watching. Ash would stand by the fence and watch them too, his tail flicking, muscles twitching with something he couldn't name. He didn't try to follow them. But he didn't ignore them either. Ellen began to wonder if Ghost had sent them. Had he led them here? Were they survivors of something darker than the forest? Men, perhaps, with snares and bullets and steel traps? The wound said as much. And then one morning she found the mare standing inside the fence. Ellen froze when she saw her, just 20 yards away, her breath fogging in the early light, her stance alert but not hostile. Ash trotted up, touched noses with her, and for a second the silence between them shimmered like heat. Ellen didn't move. Didn't want to shatter it. But it shattered anyway. The stallion, the one who limped, screamed suddenly from beyond the fence. A horrible guttural sound that cracked the morning open. Then came the second scream, higher, younger. The colt. Fear soaked Ellen's spine like ice. She ran. The forest edge erupted. Two men emerged, rough, armed, eyes sharp and cruel. One held a whip. The other a rifle. They weren't poachers. They were worse. They were traitors. Traffickers of the wild. The stallion stumbled back as one of the men advanced, rope swinging. The younger horse tried to bolt, but the second man caught its flank with a lashing blow, sending it screaming sideways into the underbrush. Ellen didn't think. She didn't pause. She screamed. Get off my land. The men turned, startled. The one with the rifle raised it, just slightly. Not enough to shoot, just enough to threaten. You feeding them? He barked. These are wild. Government property. You've injured them, Ellen shouted, advancing without a weapon, without a plan, just fury. You don't belong here. They ain't tagged, the second man growled. That makes them free stock. Ellen stopped a few feet away. Her voice dropped. They're not stock. They're survivors. And they're mine now. Silence. Then came the sound behind her, hoofbeats. The mare. Together. They charged, not at the men but toward the trees. A blur of muscle and wild fury. The distraction worked. The rifle jerked. The whip cracked but missed. Ellen lunged. She grabbed a branch, swung hard, catching the rifleman across the chest. He stumbled, swore, turned the gun toward her. But by then Ash was between them, rearing, screaming, every inch of him lit with the fire of his ancestors. The man backed off, stumbling. The second tried to catch the colt again, but the mare circled back, faster than pain, and struck. Her hooves connected with his shoulder. He went down hard. And then it was over. The men ran, bleeding, bruised, swearing. Ash trotted back to Ellen. She dropped to her knees and hugged him. She was shaking. So was he. The forest fell quiet again. And the wild stayed. That night, Ellen built a new enclosure at the back of the barn, larger, secure. She guided the injured stallion inside, cleaned his wound as best she could. The colt she named Rain. The mare she didn't name at all. She didn't need to. Some things stayed beyond names. Days passed. The herd healed. Ash no longer stared at them with longing. Now he walked among them like a brother, not quite leader, not quite follower, but one of them all the same. And Ellen? She felt whole again. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she had done something with it. She had turned loss into shelter, emptiness into purpose. The land, once silent and gray, now echoed with laughter, whinnies, the rustle of hooves on grass. One morning, as she stood by the fence watching the sunrise bleed over the hills, she heard footsteps behind her. A figure, tall, weathered, a ranger. "I heard," he said, "about what happened here." She didn't speak, just nodded. "I came to check the claim. See if they're tagged, registered." "They're not," she said. He paused. "Then they're not protected." "They're protected now," she replied, voice steel. The ranger studied her for a long moment, then looked at the horses. "They trust you." "They saved me," she said. He nodded. "I'll do what I can." And he left. Later that week she found a small package left at her door. Inside was a government form, blank and signed, but attached was a handwritten note. Asterisk, "There's no law that says kindness isn't legal." Asterisk. The wind shifted again. But this time it carried warmth. And something new. The morning began like any other, quiet, cool, with a hush over the land that made it feel like the earth was still holding its breath. Ellen moved through her routine with practiced ease. Feed the horses. Check the stallions wound. Brush down Ash, who still insisted on his daily grooming with a touch of pride, though he now spent most of his hours running with Rain and the mare they had all come to respect but never tried to tame. The forest was still as if watching her. She had grown into this life. Not in leaps and revelations but in steady, aching pieces. Each scar she carried now served a purpose. The grief that once swallowed her had been transformed into something unexpected, strength. The mare approached first that morning. Not out of hunger or curiosity. This time she came with intention. Her body, though lean and worn from past hardship, moved like the wind, graceful, commanding. Ellen paused with a half-filled pail of water in her hand and watched the animal walk directly toward her, eyes bright with something deeper than instinct. She stopped only a few feet away. Ellen set the bucket down. Didn't move. The mare dipped her head low and nudged Ellen's hand gently, then backed away. Her breath steamed in the cold. She turned, gave one short whinny toward the trees, and vanished into the forest like smoke. Ellen frowned, unsure. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, soft, too light to be wind. A cry. Fragile and brief. Not the call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. It was a baby's cry. She froze. The sound came again, closer this time from the direction the mare had disappeared into. Heart-pounding, Ellen sprinted. Branches whipped her arms. Brambles tugged her jeans. But she didn't slow. Her ears tuned to the sound, and when it came again, louder, desperate, she followed it, breath catching in her chest. There. Beneath a gnarled oak tree, hidden in a blanket of moss and leaves, lay a small, bundled shape. Not an animal. A child. Wrapped in an old flannel shirt, no more than a few months old. Pale. Trembling. But alive. Ellen dropped to her knees, lifted the baby gently into her arms. Its skin was cold but not blue. Its tiny hands curled around her finger with surprising strength. She looked up, bewildered. The mare stood a distance away watching. Ellen stared at her. "Where did you?" But no answer came. Just that solemn, unwavering gaze. Then the mare turned once more and disappeared, for the last time, into the trees. Back at the house, Ellen lit the fire, wrapped the baby in warm blankets and called every emergency number she knew. The sheriff came first, then social services. Questions followed. None had answers. No missing reports. No abandoned car. No clues. Only this child, found in the wild, brought to her by a horse. Days passed. No one came forward. And the child, now fed, bathed, and swaddled in Ellen's care, grew stronger by the hour. He had bright eyes and a quiet curiosity. He didn't cry often, but when he did, Ash would come to the window, ears twitching, and let out soft nickers as if soothing him from afar. The connection was immediate. Like destiny. Social services, overwhelmed and short on foster homes, asked if Ellen would be willing to keep the child temporarily. Just until placement, they said. She agreed without hesitation. They named him Luke. And Ellen knew deep down, there would be no other placement. Luke belonged here. It wasn't always easy. Sleepless nights, worry she was doing it wrong, fear that something might still come and take him away. But she had faced worse. She had outlived grief, buried love, and stood against men with guns. This was a different kind of challenge. This was hope. Luke thrived. He loved the outdoors, squealed with joy whenever the horses came near, and reached for Ash with little hands that never shook. By the time he could stand, Alan was teaching him how to hold a brush, how to move slow around the stallion, how to listen to the silence of the land. He listened better than most grown men ever did. Seasons changed. The barn was rebuilt, reinforced. The pasture expanded. Alan's land, once forgotten, had become a haven, not just for horses but for broken things. She took in another foal left orphaned after a storm. A limping dog someone had dumped by the roadside. And always Luke by her side, watching, learning, healing. The wild never took the mare back into view. But Alan felt her, in the wind, the way the sun warmed certain corners of the forest. Ghost never returned either, but part of him lived in Ash, and in the stallion who still bore the scar on his side but now ran like wind without pain. Then came the letter. Sealed, government embossed. Inside was paperwork, final adoption forms for Luke. Signed, approved, official. He was hers. She stood on the porch that night, the document in her hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but the full circle of something sacred. What the wild had given her wasn't just a gift. It was redemption. The horses stood in the field, illuminated by the last golden rays of dusk. Ash lifted his head and looked at her, his breath curling into the cold air. Behind her, a small voice. "Mom?" She turned. Luke, no longer a baby but still young, still full of light, stood in the doorway, blanket trailing behind him. She knelt down, opened her arms. He ran into them. And in that moment nothing else mattered. Not the past. Not the pain. Not even the mystery of how it had all come to be. Because life had chosen her again. She had given a meal to a starving horse once. And in return, the wild had given her something no one else could. A family. A future. A chance to begin again. The land grew quiet under the stars, but Alan's heart did not. It beat strong, fierce, and steady, echoing the rhythm of hooves, the cry of the wind, and the unbreakable bond that now tethered them all together in this strange, beautiful corner of the world. Where pain met purpose. Where the wild still whispered. And where love, unexpected and wild as a Mustang, had come thundering back home.